Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we're going to be discussing the distinction between deduction and induction, or deductive and inductive arguments. Deductive arguments are the arguments that are valid and sound, and inductive arguments are the ones that are strong and cogent. With deductive arguments, what we say is that there is a necessary connection between the premises and conclusion of the argument, and while with inductive arguments, there is a connection between the premises and conclusion that is built on probability or likelihood. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple examples to see the point here. So the first example is a deductive argument about Socrates. So it says 1, Socrates is human, 2, all humans are mortal, therefore 3, Socrates is mortal. So this is a deductive argument, a valid one. And notice again the necessary connection between the premises and conclusion. The only possible conclusion that can follow from those premises is that Socrates is mortal. And so what we have is that necessary connection we need in our deductive argument and our valid argument, and so this is a deductive argument. And then secondly, we'll look at an example of an inductive argument. The example is the rain tomorrow example, and so the premise here is that 1, the weather forecast is for rain tomorrow, and so therefore 2, our second premise is then 2, that it's rained all week, and so therefore 3, it will rain tomorrow. So again, this is that kind of prediction we see with strong arguments, and this is also an inductive argument. And notice again the idea of probability or likelihood that's built into the connection between the premises and conclusion. The premises make the conclusion to be more likely, right? If it's rained all week, that makes the conclusion that it's going to rain tomorrow more likely. But then also, if the weather prediction is for rain tomorrow, that as well makes the conclusion to be more likely that it's going to rain tomorrow. Okay? But again, of course, the idea is that that connection between the premises and conclusion is not a necessary one, because of course, even if it's rained all week and even if the weather forecast is for rain tomorrow, then the conclusion that it's going to rain tomorrow could still turn out to be false. Okay, and again, that's the next kind of lead-in with inductive arguments, right? We see always with inductive arguments a kind of prediction being made. And the prediction is usually one about the future or something like this. So we see, for example, our rain tomorrow example, the weather forecast is for rain tomorrow, and secondly, it's rained all week, and so therefore we conclude that it's going to rain tomorrow. Again, we have a kind of prediction here, and it's really just a prediction about the weather tomorrow. And so we have that inductive argument with that element of prediction. The next example we see is the sun rises and sets example. In the sun rises and sets example, we also have a kind of prediction being made. So the first premise says that every day of my life the sun has risen in the morning and set in the evening. And so therefore we predict from that the sun will rise in the morning and set in the evening tomorrow, right? And again, it's a kind of prediction quite simply about what will happen tomorrow. We have our third example to show this predictive element is the Swans example, right? So this example has the first premise being that every swan I've ever seen is white, and then secondly that we conclude that all swans are white. Notice here the prediction's a bit different, right? In this case, it's a prediction about the color of all swans, not so much about the future, but about this kind of prediction about these swans, okay? But nevertheless, a prediction still. The next point we'll make is about inductive arguments, and we can see that point with the sun rises and sets example again. Again, our example says that the sun has risen and set every day of my life, and so therefore the sun will rise and set tomorrow. In this case, you'll see that the conclusion being a kind of prediction about tomorrow, it happens to be rather interesting information. It's kind of almost a guess, and it's also quite new and exciting information, right? Guesses and predictions kind of are like that, right? They're kind of like exciting and new, and they may turn out to be false, and so it's a bit interesting, right? On the other hand, with a deductive argument, we see that this is not the case. So consider the Socrates is mortal example again. We have the premise Socrates is human, and then we also have the premise all humans are mortal, and then our conclusion is that Socrates is mortal. In this case, we don't really have a new and interesting conclusion because we kind of see, I think there's a sense in which you see the conclusion coming. And we also say that the conclusion is kind of almost built out of the premises. It's almost, another way to put it is it's almost like the conclusion is a bit like reading between the lines that you get with the premises, right? And so you kind of see the conclusion coming before you even read it. And that's a bit why the argument happens to be a valid argument, right? It's this kind of necessary connection between the premises and conclusion, because the conclusion really is in the premises all along, and so we don't really have any kind of new information in that conclusion, right? Now, the last point that we're going to make, I think, is that the concept with induction is a bit forward-looking, and in a bit kind of almost looks into the future, right? And so we can see this with our April 10 example. So imagine that it has rained every April 10 that you can remember. Imagine that being the case. Imagine that it's rained every April 10 at the college for the last 10 years, right? And so you conclude that the coming April 10, it will rain as well at the college, right? In this case, right, we have again a prediction about the future, namely about April 10th. But notice though that in making this prediction about the future, we're kind of assuming here that the future is going to be like the past, right? We're going to assume that this April 10 will be like the past 10, and that we'll have rain just like we had before, right? But also notice that a lot of times it just so happens that this kind of assumption about the future resembling the past, this doesn't always have to be true, right? Because on certain occasions, it just so happens that the future turns out to be different, right? I always like to put it like this, that imagine that the future always did resemble the past, that the future never changed, how boring life would be, right? And that's a bit like why life can be exciting sometimes, right? Because the future changes. So because these inductive arguments are built on the idea that the future resembles the past, we see why then that because the future can change, why then that we have inductive arguments and strong arguments where we have true premises and actually a false conclusion, because quite simply the future can be different, it can change, right? So we see here our example, our April 10 example. We can kind of reformalize the example to have the premise that the future will resemble the past. So here we have the premise, it has rained every April 10 I can remember, and 2, the future resembles the past, therefore 3, it will rain this April 10. So again, given that our second premise here doesn't always turn out to be true, again, we can have an argument in which we have a true premise and that it's rained the last 10 Aprils or every April I can remember, and yet a false conclusion, right? We can also think about this kind of notion, this idea about the prediction, this idea about this forward-looking element about the future resembling the past and all of this, and the idea of traffic, right? In predicting our routes to, for example, school or work. We do this based upon a kind of inductive argument, okay? And so the idea is that if, for example, I'm predicting how to get to the college today, and in the past, the 405 freeway has been my best bet, right? It's been the quickest route with the least amount of traffic. Then what I do is I go based upon that past history. I predict that today the 405 will work out well as well, and so then I take the 405 to get to the college, right? But again, the future can change, right? It can be different, as always seems to work out. And so maybe the 405 doesn't work out too well today, right? And so again, this this day, maybe the 405 isn't the best way to get to the college. And so again, this is exactly why we see the idea that with inductive arguments, we have this element of probability and likelihood, because the future can quite simply change, and our predictions can turn out to be wrong on occasion. And so then, it can work out sometimes that with inductive arguments, you have true premises and a false conclusion. All right, and so that'll be it for this video today. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time. Thank you.